We've got a pretty good group here, so thank you so much everyone for coming today. We want to welcome you to today's webinar, which is part of our Young Scholar series on climate change, macroeconomics, and finance for the E-Axis Forum. I'm Mike Barnett. I'd like to welcome our PhD committee, who's student committee, who have been helping and being a part of this, and thankful to all of you who are here participating. Now, before we get started, we'd like to make an announcement. So we'd like to announce that we have a new call for papers for our Young Scholars webinar series. We draw from this sort of call for papers to help us put together our presentations, and we'll be drawing from the submitted papers for our winter term, the 2025 winter term. So please see the E-Access website homepage, which we'll post in the chat for more details, or you can send submissions directly to info@eaccess.org. And we as a committee review those papers, and we always look forward to seeing some of the new work that's in this area. So we'd love to have people submit papers to include in our presentation series. And with that, today's webinar is going to be Maxime Sauzet. We're very excited to hear from him and hear this paper. He's going to be addressing two important questions. And one, in a world in which financial intermediaries do not account for environmental and ESG considerations, can green retail investors still affect the cost of capital of green firms and therefore the green transition? And if financial intermediaries started to tilt towards green assets, or were made to tilt, say by regulation, how large could the effect be? Maxime has a lot of great work in the area of climate finance and is also just a wonderful researcher in terms of computational analysis, and I always enjoy his presentation. So I will turn the time over to Maxime. We'll sort of go about 45 minutes or so, try and leave 5 or 10 minutes for Q&A at the end. However, if you have questions or clarifications or comments, please put them in the chat and the Q&A. I'll be moderating and looking through, and either Maxime or I will recognize those and answer some of those. So with that, I will turn the time over for you, and very much looking forward to your presentation.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Mike, for the kind words. Thank you so much for having me on the program. It's really a great pleasure to be here today. And I'm going to actually talk about a paper which is quite new. So all your comments are very welcome. And so the starting point, in a sense, is quite simple. We've had a very fast-growing literature in sustainable finance that studies the impact of having green investors in the economy on buy cycles, right? Premia, portfolios, and the transition itself. And the main conclusion so far is that when you have green investors in the economy, the green asset that they prefer should tend to have, if anything, lower expected returns on average, either because those assets, those investors care so much about those assets that they're going to be willing to take a cut in terms of their returns, or because of things like kind of climate risks, right? And so this negative green premium, which is how we call it, is both the main prediction, and it's also what you want. Why it should tend to foster investment towards a greener firm through a kind of a lower cost of capital. That said, most of the literature so far actually assume that all investors in the economy, especially green investors, can actually freely trade all assets in the economy, especially green and brown assets, and can therefore kind of freely express their preferences and, if you impact the pricing of those assets, right? But if you think of investing in practice, it's not quite the way it works. In practice, most investors do not invest in kind of individual assets, and instead they're going to invest the bulk of their wealth through financial intermediaries, such as banks or investment funds, right? And so what it means is that those intermediaries, not investors themselves, are going to be the one doing the allocation into different kind of assets and strategies. And so, just to give you a sense that this is not innocuous, even though it's probably obvious, the graph on the left here shows you the amount of money that's actually managed by some of those intermediaries, in that case, kind of investment funds. So, massive amount in recent years, especially when it comes to kind of passive type strategies, right? So something that's kind of very big for investing in general, this kind of delegation, and then something that is becoming big for sustainable investing in particular, because the graph on the right here shows you that in recent years, many of those intermediaries, and again, especially investment funds, have been making some kind of commitment towards sustainability, right? Now, just to say about a quick word about the flip side of those commitments. There's also a lot of debate about whether those are kind of meaningful at all. A lot of greenwashing concern, And more recently, especially in the US, a lot of backlash with a very intense political and regulatory pressure to try to make some of those intermediaries kind of back away from some of those commitments, right? And this also seems to be working. Here are a few articles that shows you that in recent months or years, BlackRock, Vanguard, and others have been actually putting out from some of those net zero alliances and related initiatives. And so, this is kind of where we are in terms of sustainable investing. Actually, it's kind of very, very big picture. And so to me, those kind of observations give rise to two broad set of questions, right? That's the one that Mike just mentioned a few seconds ago. The first one is that, if we're in a world in which intermediaries do not care about these kind of issues, can there be any hope for green retail investors to have any impact on the pricing of those assets and therefore on the transition? Kind of the first question. And the flip side is, if financial intermediaries do start tilting towards those green assets, or again are made to, let's say by regulators, how large can this impact be, and under what conditions? Okay? And so to me, those questions are kind of really central for that field, and this is what I'm going to be trying to tackle in this space. Okay? All right, so to do this, I'm going to take for today kind of a purely theoretical angle and develop an intermediate asset pricing model of sustainable investing, in which we're going to have basically two groups of investors. Okay? On one hand, we're going to have kind of end investors. So think of them as kind of retail investors with one green and one neutral retail. And then on the other hand, we're going to have one financial intermediary. And this financial intermediary is basically going to be the only investor that can trade all assets in the economy. Okay? So here the assets are going to be two equity assets, green and brown, and then one risk-free bond. And because she's the only investor that can trade all assets in the economy, this intermediary is going to be playing a very central role because she's basically going to be setting the portfolio for the whole economy. Okay, and we'll see that in some detail. So that will be the setup. Now, in the background, I'm going to solve the model kind of globally using kind of higher dimensional methods. Although I'm not going to talk about this too much today; it's a bit on the technical side. But mostly what I'm going to do is, characterize asset returns, risk premium, and portfolios in this economy in kind of various cases. Okay, and so this is going to allow us to talk about, this is going to provide some kind of general framework, theoretical framework, to talk about those questions. And one thing that I want to point out is, many of those questions or many of those things are not really observed empirically for now, at least not fully. And so, taking this theoretical routes is one way to get some insight on some of those topics. All right, so that's what I do. Now, what do I find? Just as a quick preview, the first thing is, well, if we're in a world in which intermediaries, again, do not really care about this kind of issues, they don't have any kind of grid preferences, it's going to turn out that green retail investors could still have a strong impact on the pricing of those assets, okay, at least theoretically. And so, this is kind of the good news. They can still kind of lower the cost of capital for those firms that they prefer. That's the good news. Now, as we will see, this is actually going to come with a lot of qualifications that are likely actually to be quite relevant in practice. And so, this is going to be a bit of a yes but answer. Okay, so those green retail investors can have a strong impact, but it's very kind of indirect. What about the flip side then, which is when intermediaries themselves start tilting towards those green assets? Well, here the punchline is going to be that in that case, the impact is going to be substantial. Okay, in particular, it's going to be much larger than this indirect impact that I've talked about just before. We'll see where this is going to come from, but the impact is going to be large on average in that case. But in particular, when the preferences of those intermediaries are actually aligned with those of retail investors. Bigger picture, I think this is going to highlight that financial intermediaries could play a very central role when it comes to financing the green transition or related questions. And again, if they do start accounting for these kind of topics, I think intermediaries could be becoming a very powerful actor when it comes to solving those challenges, right? So this could, to some extent, alleviate some of the concern we've had in literature that this cost of capital type channel might actually be too small to have an impact. But again, if they do not account for them, I think the real question is, can there be any hope for us to kind of tackle them given the massive need for financing that we actually have. And so, to me, this kind of central role of intermediaries is probably why we've had such a heated debate on those topics recently. All right, let me say a quick word about the literature, and then I'll stop if there's any kind of brief questions. So, on the sustainable finance side, the focus has not really been too much on those intermediary, at least not in this kind of asset pricing type setup. One exception is the paper by Pastor, Stambo, and Taylor that I've mentioned actually already. And in this paper, they kind of find mostly empirically that actually intermediaries, especially green funds, do not seem to have been kind of tilting very much in recent years, right? So in terms, that's kind of the starting point of what I'm trying to do. And I'm going to provide some kind of a GE asset pricing take on this topic to try to see, what could happen if this were to change. Okay? Then on the kind of theory side, the model is going to build on kind of multi-agent, multi-assets type asset pricing model on which kind of several of us have been working on. But more specifically, this is going to build on the intermediary asset pricing type literature in the spirit of Hearn and Krishnamurti and others. And on top of this, here I'm going to have two risky assets, so green and brown, two retail investors, green and neutral, and then general preferences, and this tilt towards the green asset. Okay? So each of those is going to be new and will be important for what I'm trying to say in this paper. And then one quick word on the computational side. So I'm not going to talk about this too much today. It's more going to be in the background, but I kind of want to solve this model globally. It's kind of important for this kind of models, but also this type of questions. And so to do this, I'm actually going to use somewhat standard projection approaches. In the recent past, I and others, including Mike, have been working on methods to try to solve those models with kind of neural network as an approximator to try to get to kind of higher dimensions and things like that. So here I'm not going to quite use this, but I'm still going to use the technical apparatus that actually come with it to solve the model in a kind of a faster way. Okay? So it's going to be a bit of a hybrid methods in between the two. I'll say a few words about this very briefly, but not too much. So if you're interested, we can talk about this also towards the end. Last thing, but so Mike mentioned this already, but so this is part of a kind of a broader set of papers that I've worked on related to those topics. So I worked with David Zabing on green consumption in this kind of models, and starting from this and also the paper today, I am very much working on many kind of follow-up papers. So I may say a few words about this towards the end if we have a bit of time, but yeah. So Jean says that this is all mostly on the theory, and so today this is going to be very much theory. I also have some recent work on the more empirical side, but again, I'm not going to say much about this today. Okay, so just to give you a bit of an overview. All right, so that's all for the introduction, and so that's going to be the outline. Let me just mention this, and then Mike, you can tell me if there's any kind of pressing question. So basically, I'm going to first set up the economy, then we'll spend a bit of time on the characterization, and then mostly we'll focus on those two cases that we have here. Okay. All right, so that's the plan. I don't see anything from Mike, so feel free to stop me.
You can keep going.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much. Feel free to stop me if there's anything. All right, the economy. So from a very broad perspective, the economy is quite simple. We have two investors, or two groups of investors, green and neutral. And then in most of the literature so far, those investors can invest in anything that they want. Okay, so they can invest in kind of green equity or green tree, a brown equity, and then in some kind of riskless. Okay, and then I'm going to be interested in a GE economy, and so they're going to use the proceeds of those investments to finance their consumption of the goods. Okay. Now, as I've argued, that's not quite the world that we live in, and instead, the world that we live in, and the one that I want to kind of study in this paper is this one. A world in which retail investors cannot directly trade in the assets. Instead, are going to have to go through this intermediary because we're the one doing the allocation. Okay? And so this is kind of the framework in a nutshell. Now I'm going to give you a bit more details on what's in the background. All right, so first supply. So for today, the supply is going to be actually very simple. It's going to be a pure exchange economy in which the output of those two trees, Lucas trees, or those two firms, is going to be exogenous. Kind of follows this process here, but then everything else is going to be endogenous, right? Especially the asset returns. This is kind of a GE economy. It's part of the point. Here, as a side note, I mentioned some kind of follow-up work. One of them is very much working on version with endogenous production of this. And I think that could be kind of very interesting and important, especially when it comes to thinking about the transition. So again, we can talk about this maybe towards the end a little bit, but for today, we'll kind of leave this aside. Okay. All right, so supply side pretty simple, and then the demand side is potentially going to be a bit more interesting. So here you have the problem first of the intermediary, and in there you basically have three main elements. The first one is going to be recursive preferences here in blue, and so those are here for basically kind of quantitative reasons. Okay. Second, you have those portfolio weights in orange here. And what matters is that the intermediary is actually free to invest in those different assets to set her portfolio optimally. And lastly, you have those terms in green here, which are those kind of environmental tilts that go kind of towards these green assets and go beyond financial consideration. And so, those tilts are going to be kind of in the spirit of the existing literature, but the key difference here is this is going to apply to the intermediary. And so those tilts parameters are going to be quite important, and we'll talk about them quite a bit. Okay. Now, because she's the intermediary, the portfolio that she sets is actually also going to be the one that is offered to retail investors. So I'm sometimes going to call this the intermediary portfolio or the intermediary assets, which is basically going to be kind of a weighted average of the assets in the econ. And when it comes to those weights, I'll focus on two main cases. The first one is going to be pure indexing. So here the idea is, the intermediary in that case is going to be just a pass through, setting the portfolio equals to the market. So think of it as kind of BlackRock or some kind of index fund. But then I'll also say a word about this full intermediary case in which she also has kind of consumption and wealth of her own, and sets his portfolio optimally. And so this is going to allow us to talk about kind of different cases and different types of intermediaries, which is kind of part of the appeal of this framework. All right, so that's the intermediary. And then just to wrap up this setup, this is kind of the problem for retail investors. So it looks very similar to before, but there's one key difference though, which is that they're not going to be able, those retail investors, to invest in the individual assets, and instead they can only decide how much wealth to put in this intermediary asset. Okay? This is really kind of the central point for this setup and for the paper. Okay? All right, so I'm pretty much done with the setup. I'm just going to say briefly a few words about the equilibrium, and then on the computational side, but then we'll move to the characterization. Okay? All right, equilibrium. So the definition for the equilibrium is going to be pretty standard. Investors are going to kind of solve their problems, taking things as given, and markets are going to clear. Just one thing to make sure that the setup is kind of clear. I wanted to show you the market clearing condition for equity here. And so what you see is, as I was saying, retail investors can only decide how much wealth to put in the intermediary asset itself. Right, so those are those weights here. But then how this is split between the green and the brown assets is going to be determined by the portfolio of the choice of the intermediary. Right. What you see here is that in the background, those retail investors kind of still holds the assets. It's just that they do not decide how much wealth to put in each of them. Okay. So just without loss of generality, but this is kind of the way those models are set up. So I just wanted to make sure that this is kind of clear. Beyond that, this is kind of a pretty standard, and so you can do the usual thing, which is to recast this equilibrium as a so-called recursive Markovian equilibrium, in which basically everything is going to be a function of three state variables. Okay. The first one is going to be U here. It's going to be the wealth share of the intermediary in total wealth. Second, within retail wealth, how much wealth is going to be held by the green retail investor? So it's going to be this X. And then the last one is this Y variable here, which is basically the output share of the green firm in the econ. This kind of variable here often shows up in those multi-trees type models. And so, everything is going to be a function of those three variables. Just to say, what about the U here? When we'll talk about the pure indexing case, in which the intermediary is kind of a pass through without consumption or anything, you can think of this as U equal to 0. But then beyond that, everything will be a function of those three. Okay, and so we'll talk about them quite a bit. All right, so that's the equilibrium, and then lastly, for the setup, a word about the kind of computational aspect. So I kind of want to solve this model globally. Again, it's important for this type of models. I think it's important also for this type of questions. And so basically, what it means is, I'm going to have a system of equations to solve and a bunch of kind of unknown, both value functions and kind of policy functions. And then what I'm going to use, big picture, is so-called projection approaches. And what it means is I'm going to, basically approximate each of those unknown functions by something, and then solve this approximated system. Now, as I've mentioned before, in the recent past, I and others, including Mike, I've worked on versions to, algorithm to solve those things with neural network as an approximator. It allows us to go to kind of much higher dimensions and potentially to capture much stronger non-linearities. Today, I'm not going to do this. I am going to stick to using more standard polynomials, typically Chebyshev polynomials, as my approximator. But I'm going to use the kind of technical apparatus that actually comes with neural network methods. Okay, so in particular, automatic differentiation and just-in-time compiling. Okay. So basically, this is going to allow me to solve this, you think, a bit more standard methods, but much faster. Okay. So just to give you a sense, I'm solving this three-state variable problem on my laptop without too much. So in some sense, that's kind of a hybrid approach. And I think in some cases that could be useful. One thing is, neural network. If you work with them a little bit, one thing that is tricky with them is to get them to kind of really converge. Why when it comes to kind of Chebyshev polynomials and things like that, they do have slightly better convergence properties. And so, in some cases that might be kind of enough. And so that might be a good approximator. So I think, all of those different methods are different ways to basically get to solving higher dimensional models. Okay. So again, it's a bit on the kind of technical side, and I'm not going to say much more about this now, but happy to talk about this some more towards the end or offline. All right, so that's pretty much for the economy, and now we're in shape to talk about the equilibrium. For this equilibrium, we can characterize many different things, and I do all of this in the paper. But for today, I'm basically going to focus only on portfolios and asset returns, and actually quite briefly, just to set the stage, and then we'll move to the main results. All right, so let's do this. So portfolios. So here you have them for the intermediary and then the retail investors. They're kind of different, but for all of them, you basically have, again, three main pieces. First one in blue is going to be some kind of market / myopic term. So, this is kind of a usual thing, but actually they will turn out to be very important today. Then again, you have those, not again, but you have those hedging terms, which are in the spirit of Merton. They're in orange here. It turns out that for today, they actually don't play a super important role. So actually, mostly I'm not going to talk about them much. And then lastly, you have those terms in green here, which are coming from the environmental tilt towards the green assets that go, again, beyond financial consideration. Okay? So actually, think of the phi b here as being 0 for the brown assets, and it's just mostly the phi g. So you have some tilt towards the green assets. And so, the portfolios are going to be basically the results of those different pieces, and we'll see what they look like in a few minutes. Beyond that, one thing that I want to kind of mention once again is, as you can see, the intermediary can trade the assets separately, and so that's why she kind of decides both the weight on the green and the brown assets. While for retail investors, again, they only decide how much wealth to put in the intermediary itself. Okay. All right, so that's portfolios. And then just to say what about the returns, just be kind of the flip side of those portfolios. So here you have the risk premia for the green and the brown assets. Again, think of this phi b here as being 0. And so one thing that is kind of important is that in general, only the intermediary is going to be able to trade those assets kind of separately. And so basically, she's going to be the one pinning down their returns. So what it means is that when you look at those expressions, you have again 3 main pieces, and the first one is going to be this kind of market slash wealth term, and this is going to be driven by the covariance of the asset returns with the wealth of this investor doing the price. Okay, so in the general case, it's going to be the intermediary. When we talk about the pure indexing case, the intermediary is kind of just a pass through, and so in that case, the neutral investor will actually play that. Okay, and so we'll see that in more details, and those terms here actually will play an important role. Okay, we'll see that. Again, you have those hedging terms in orange, not super important for today, and then you have those terms in green, which are coming from the environmental tilt on the part of the intermediary. And so what you see here is, if this intermediary has a tilt, so a phi g, which is positive, let's say, this can have a direct impact on the pricing of those assets, and we'll see that. But I think what's also interesting is, okay, what if those intermediaries do not have any kind of tilt? Okay, and in that case, the question becomes, can there be any differences in the pricing of those two assets? And if yes, it's going to have to come from those terms that you have here on the left. Right? In fact, this is actually the first question we're going to be tackling right now. Okay. All right, so let's do this. First, this world in which intermediaries do not have any kind of green preferences or kind of green tilt. Okay. Again, just to reiterate, the question is, in that case, can a green retail investor have any kind of differential impact on the pricing of those two assets? So, can there be a green premium? And first, we'll look at this in the pure indexing case, foremost actually, and then a few words about the full intermediary. All right, so let's do the pure indexing case, and so here I'm going to show you the first and main result. Okay, so what do I show here? This is the risk premium on the green assets as a function of y, which is this output share of the green firm in the economy. But then more importantly, I'm showing you different curves for different values of the environmental tilt of the green retail investor. Okay, so what you see is when the green retail is small, well, not much difference, but it's actually not very surprising. But as she gets bigger in the economy, and as she gets very big in the economy, this green retail, you have this kind of negative gap that opens up. And so what he's saying is that the risk premium on the green assets gets actually much smaller, much lower when the green retail is large and when her environmental tilt gets large. Okay. And so in short, this is the good and perhaps surprising news. The green retail can have a strong impact on those returns, even though the index is actually not directly tilted. So she can lower the cost of capital for those firms that she prefers. Okay. So how's that possible, right? This green retail cannot directly invest in the assets, and so she cannot directly impact their pricing. It turns out that even though she cannot directly invest in the assets, this green retail, she can still modulate how much of her wealth she puts in them by modulating how much of her wealth she puts in the index itself. Okay. So what you see here in the middle is that this green retail investor is going to put a lot of wealth in the index when this Y variable here is large, meaning that the green firm dominates the economy in terms of output, which means that it's going to dominate the index in terms of market cap. Okay, and so by doing this, this green retail, by putting a lot of wealth in the index in those cases, she can actually tilt towards that green asset that she prefers. But this is going to be in a very kind of imperfect and indirect fashion, because when she does that, the brown assets is a small part of the index in those cases, but it's still in there, right? And so in that sense, this tilt is going to be kind of an imperfect target. Okay? So that's for the green retail investor. Now, what about the other investor? In that case, the neutral investor. Well, it's going to have to take the flip side of this by market clearing. And so it's going to have to basically underweight the green assets in his portfolio. Okay? And so it means his wealth is going to load less on the green assets. Okay? But then when it comes to the pricing of those assets, as I said, there's no tilt of the index, and so this is going to have to come from the kind of wealth term. So the covariance of the asset returns with the wealth of this kind of neutral investor doing the pricing. And here what I said is this wealth loads less on the green assets. Okay? And so if you calculate this covariance here, you're actually going to get a lower number for the green assets, meaning that it's going to provide a lot of diversification benefits for the neutral investor. Right? It's going to pay when his wealth is actually low. So what it means, bottom line is, in equilibrium, this green asset is actually going to be less risky from the perspective of that investor. And this is why it's going to have a lower expected returns, lower cost of capital on average. Okay? So this is the graph that I've shown you before. This is how this shows up here, okay? Purely endogenously in that case. Okay? All right, so that's kind of the good news. Let me make sure that the light comes back. That's the good news. The green retail can have an impact. Now, does it mean that we should kind of declare victory? Doesn't matter what intermediaries do. We can always impact the pricing. Not quite, right? As we'll see, this comes with a lot of qualifications. Okay. The first one is, this mechanism that I've described for the green assets actually also applies to the brown assets because of this imperfect targeting, even though it's going to be kind of in a lesser extent. And the question then becomes, about the green premium. So difference between the expected returns on the green and the brown assets, and can this become negative in the way that we want to kind of foster green investment, right? And so here I'm showing you that indeed this green premium can be negative. This is what I'm putting here. But first, this is going to depend a lot on economic conditions. Right? What you see here is, again, the green retail investor must be large enough in terms of wealth, and then she must be able to tilt towards that green asset in the first place. And so what it means is the green firm must kind of dominate the economy. In fact, when the green firm is kind of much smaller in the economy, which to be honest, in practice is probably quite relevant right now, this impact is much more muted. And in fact, if anything, mildly positive. In fact, this itself, this bump, depends a lot on the economic specification, because if you go to full recursive preferences, this bump here gets much larger, meaning you can have some kind of consolidated effect on the green premium. It can become positive. So bottom line, this green premium depends a lot on economic conditions and specifications in that case. Okay. Lastly, one thing I don't to mention is, even though they can have this indirect impact, those end investors, I also want to stress that this asks a lot from them, right? Again, they must invest in this very stake-dependent fashion in the index, as we've seen before. In fact, they need to borrow in the safe assets to be able to do this in the first place. And then lastly, it kind of assume that they know the index composition in the first place, actually quite finely, right? And so, depending on who those investors are, there's a real question of whether this is realistic, right? If you think of retail investors, I think it's a very big question. If those end investors are kind of institutional investors, then it might be that it's a little bit more plausible. Okay? So definitely a question to kind of keep in mind, and overall, quite a few caveats in this pure indexing. Okay? All right, let me just wrap up this world in which the intermediaries still doesn't have any kind of green tilt or green preferences with just a brief discussion on this full intermediary case. Okay, so away from the pure indexing. So here the intermediary has consumption and wealth of her own and sets the portfolio optimally. Okay, but she still doesn't have a tilt. So I'm going to be quite brief here because it's not going to change much. And the main idea is, if anything, it's going to look like the intermediary actually tried to work against the green retail investor by tilting her intermediary portfolio slightly away from the green assets to try to kind of balance out the demand from the green and the neutral retail. Okay, so if anything, it looks like she's working against the green retail. Now, it doesn't mean that the green retail cannot do this indirect tilting that I've talked about just before. But to be able to do this, she's going to have to take even more extreme positions. Okay, so in short here, this full intermediary case in that world without tilt, without intermediary tilt, can help in some other ways, but it's not going to solve the main cat. Okay, so just to wrap up this case, this world in which the intermediary does not have green preferences, the good news is green retail investors could still have a strong impact on the prices, but this comes with a lot of qualifications. Okay. All right, so that's kind of it for this case, and then the question is, okay, what about this last and different case then, which is what about the world in which the intermediary does have kind of a green tilt or green preferences? So again, this is not to say that this is really realistic. I think there's a lot of questions about whether intermediaries are doing a kind of a meaningful job on those questions recently. But I think if you think of the medium to longer run, you could think of reasons why institutions or intermediaries may want to introduce such tilts, right? Either they care about it themselves, or they want to attract capital from their investor, or again, maybe they're made to by regulators. And so because many of those things are not really observed empirically for now, this is again where the value of having such a framework also lies. We can kind of study those things. All right, so what's the idea in this case? What's the kind of the punchline? Well, it's going to turn out that when intermediary have a kind of a green tilt, the impact is going to be substantial. Okay, so this green premium can become very strongly negative and actually move mostly 1-for-1 with the tilt of the intermediary. Right? And so in particular, this is going to dwarf this indirect impact that I've talked about before, and be much less kind of sensitive to economic conditions or the specification. Now, why is that the case? Well, the first thing is the intermediary can trade the asset directly, and so she can have a direct impact on the pricing. It's kind of why her tilt directly shows up in those pricing equation. And this is actually akin to the mechanism we've had in literature, but the key difference is this applies to the intermediary. Right? She's the one that has to tilt for this direct impact to actually show up. Second, this could be kind of quite powerful because the intermediary is actually deciding on the portfolio for the whole economy. And again, here this is going to be most powerful actually when her tilt is aligned with those of retail investors. Okay. So that's kind of for the pricing. Now, just to say one word about the portfolios, as you probably expect, this intermediary is going to tilt towards the green assets because she prefers it, and the green retail investor is going to like that because she also prefers that green asset. And I just want to mention that this is kind of very different to the case that we had before, in which, if anything, the intermediary was trying to work against the green retail investor. Right? So works kind of much better. Now, does it mean that it's kind of all kind of rosy and perfect? No, it's never the case. And here in particular, the neutral investor, the neutral retail investor, is not going to like that, right? He doesn't have a tilt, and so it's not going to like this intermediary portfolio. And so, if anything, it's going to try to work against this portfolio. And in fact, if we're in a world in which all retail investors are neutral, you can have some kind of mild contravailing effect on the green premium. But as soon as the green retail has some kind of tilt and is not too small, or the tilt of the intermediary is actually not too large, or the intermediary herself is actually large enough in terms of wealth, those are going to remain kind of quite mild. And so if you in practice, you're going to have a lot of interesting kind of fluctuations and nuances, but it's basically all going to be around an average level that is determined by the tilt of the intermediary. Okay, so bottom line, the green premium is going to be large on average in that case. Okay, that's kind of the punchline. All right, so I'm mostly done with what I wanted to say about what I have so far in the paper. I'm going to say a few words about potential generalization, and then I'll wrap up. And then I see that there's a few questions potentially. We can go to the Q&A. Okay, I'm not sure how I'm doing on time, but hopefully okay.
Yeah, you're doing good.
Right.
You've got 5 or 10 minutes.
Perfect. All right, that's awesome. So let me say just a few words on those generalization, but like very briefly. It's all very new anyway. And then I'll just wrap up. All right, so I am working on a bunch of generalizations for this particular paper, but also potentially for other papers. One of them I think could be kind of quite interesting are kind of portfolio constraints. That's something that I haven't discussed so far, but I think those have been shown to be quite important in the intermediary asset pricing setup. And I think they could potentially add an interesting new layer and kind of interaction to what I've just described. And so constraint could be interesting from that perspective, also from the perspective of kind of retail investors. So I'm very much working on actually adding those as we speak. So that's good for this paper. And then I am also working on versions of this with potentially more ambitious and potentially other papers with endogenous production, as I mentioned before. So both kind of AK, but also with labor. I think there's a lot of interesting things that we can say from there, especially when we want to really talk about the transition itself, how some firms may kind of disappear and stuff like that. Mike and others have been kind of working on this kind of things. So I think there could be interesting interaction between this and the type of things that I've talked about today. So very much working on this. On the labor side, actually, I'm also working on more empirical versions of this and kind of test what's happening. But yeah, and then this is more of a side note, but you could also think of using this kind of framework or extending them to talk about kind of other topics than sustainable finance. One of them on which I've kind of worked in quite a bit in over the years is international finance, and so I'm also working on using that for that purpose. But it's a bit more of an aside. So that's pretty much all I say for those generalizations. It's pretty much still ongoing work, but yeah. Hopefully it gives you a flavor of what more we could do with this framework. All right, let me just wrap up and then get to the questions. So in this paper, I basically developed this intermediary asset pricing model of sustainable investing to talk about this world in which retail or kind of end investors cannot directly invest in the different assets. Okay, and so I think this is kind of probably quite relevant in practice. And as we've seen, the good news to some extent is that even if intermediaries not care about this kind of green topics, retail investors could still have a strong impact on the pricing when it comes with a lot of qualifications. While once intermediaries do start tilting, the impact can be much more substantial. And so bottom line, and just to go back to the big picture, I think it can highlight how central intermediaries could be when it comes to tackling those challenges. I think there's a lot more to be said on those topics. Okay. All right, that's it. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I'm very much looking forward to tackling any questions if you have any.
Awesome. Thanks, Maxime. Really appreciated it. So we've got some questions. So we'll open it up now. If you have any questions, please add those into the Q&A. We'll read through those. We have a couple of questions in the chat already that I'll read, and then I may ask a couple of questions if there's time. So let me just start with one. So Pascal had a question saying, I have a sense that many retail investors are under the impression they will get superior financial performance by investing in green assets. Once they realize that is not the case, do you think there may be a rebalancing back to a neutral or a brown tilt? And just kind of as a follow-up, another of our participants said this sort of reminds them of the ESG backlash and that things might disappear in the short term, but who knows in the long term. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's amazing questions. I mean, to be honest, like, I'm based in the US, and so you hear about the backlash a lot, right? It's kind of very present there. And on the first part of this question, which is about whether investors kind of retail investors realize that they may have to take a cut in terms of returns, I think the answer is really they don't. And I think even not just retail investors, but practitioners, right? I'm teaching the sustainable finance course here, and I have practitioners coming. And I think even in the practitioners world, the view is very much that you could have the best of both worlds, which is great returns and great kind of on the green side, great green score. I think part of this is, if you look at, I mentioned the paper by Pastor, the recent one, but there's another one that shows that even though we all expect from the model that you should have this lower return for green assets, and that's also what you want. If you look at realized returns over the last few, of the last decade or a bit more, if anything, it went completely the other way. And I think part of this is, we have a change in kind of transitory demand type changes. And investors kind of look at this stuff and say, oh, look, we can have good returns and good green scores. Like, what do you mean? And so I think, probably this is going to have to be something that's some kind of realization that investors have. I think sometimes you talk to people in private markets, and there they argue that potentially you could have the best of both worlds, because you have much more control on the firm and how it operates and stuff like that. So maybe as you become greener, you can also improve the firm in some other ways. So maybe the case there could be made maybe a bit more. But overall, I think this idea that you may lose in terms of return is very much not accepted in the market.
Perfect.
So
Awesome.
I don't know whether it answered the question, but yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a great answer, but we'll see if there's any follow-ups on that. So there's a question in the Q&A as well. It says, in terms of economic significance, under realistic assumptions of a moderate tilt by intermediaries that can be achieved, what would be more or less the impact on the cost of capital? Would this impact be meaningful? So I think sort of a quantitative question.
Yeah. So it's a good point. And I mean, even though I'm going to go back to the slide, but even though it's kind of a kind of general preference and stuff like that, I don't want to take the quantitative aspect of this model too strongly. But let's see if I have I've showed you those graphs in which the impacts can be mostly moving kind of 1-for-1 with the tilt of intermediaries. So here, whatever it is, it's if the tilt is of the equivalent of 1%, so say you are willing to forego 1 percentage point of returns to invest in greener firm, then it would kind of show up as a reduction directly of 1% in the cost of capital. Now, 1% is potentially a strong tilt to assume on the part of intermediary, right? It's not clear that on average the financial sector has this tilt. In fact, if anything, these days is closer to 0. So that's one thing. The second thing is this also requires that the green retail investor are also kind of large enough. Because I've showed you the case in which this much better, but if you go to the case in which actually all the retail investors do not really care or are kind of neutral about this kind of stuff, they can actually try to work against some of this kind of tilts on the intermediary. So I think it's kind of hard for me to make a strong, okay, this is going to be X%. I think that might need a model in which we also have kind of production and all this kind of stuff and a bit more bells and whistles. But I think the statement I want to make is, if you compare a world in which intermediaries do not tilt, and then only green investors with retail try to do it, and a world in which the intermediaries start tilting a little bit, the second one is going to have much more impact. That's kind of the point I'm trying to make. So, kind of hedging my bet here a little bit. I want to take the model too seriously either. But yeah. So that would be my answer. Hopefully, it kind of clarifies. Just one last thing on this, or what I think about it. So here I have this kind of tilt, which is kind of general. It could be anything. It could be that the intermediaries decide to tilt because they care about it. So if you talk to, I think, European asset managers and stuff like that, this is something that I think they kind of, some of them do because they want to do it. If you talk about them here in the US, this is not the case at all. They just they call on fiduciary responsibility, and they don't really want to do this. If this is what you have in mind, then the tilt might not be too large. Now, if you think of regulation, which could be one way to get those tilts to actually be larger, then that could become potentially larger than just 1% or more. So I think to also answer this question, we kind of have to take a stance on exactly what those tilts are, which is something that I haven't done quite yet. So
yeah, maybe I can ask a quick follow-up on that, and then we have a couple more questions that have come in. So and I sort of appreciate this, is that we're addressing questions where the empirical evidence can be difficult. I guess my thought is, do we have any hope to be able to think about how to empirically found these tilts, right? Those are important, and yet that's so difficult to sort of measure that. So what are your thoughts, like, or even what would be ideal if you were trying to measure that?
Yeah, so it's very so I think there's not too much work on this, but I mentioned this kind of Pastor, Stambo, and Taylor paper. This is not the kind of well-established one that everybody cites. It's newer ones. It's called Green Tilt, and in there, this is very much what they're trying to do in the empirically, right? So what they're doing, I don't remember the full details, but is basically say, okay, let's look at kind of different assets and come up with what would be the kind of market weight of those assets, and then compare how much kind of green funds, for instance, kind of overweight those assets compared to what the market weight could be. And so this is kind of a meaningful tilt, and this is the kind of measure that we would want to have to kind of compare to the model. The reason why this is a bit difficult is, so they do this exercise, and I think mostly what they find is those are kind of much smaller than what you would expect. And so, if you look at the name of those funds, or if you look at all of those, headlines that tells you that how many trillions are in sustainable investing and stuff like that, I think the point that they're trying to make is actually, if you measure this in terms of what's the real tilt, it's kind of an order of magnitude smaller than that. And so I think, as of right now, I think the difficulty is both how to kind of continue refining those kind of measures and see what's happening in practice, but also that I think in practice it's not very large, right? In practice, I think many investors or like many intermediaries are kind of hedging their bets, right? They're kind of investing in the usual things. Potentially they tilt a little bit, but it's a very tricky thing to do, especially to go back to the backlash point. In the US, it's pretty tricky, right? If you're BlackRock or Vanguard, and you were a couple of years ago claiming, oh, we're going to go full on climate finance, stuff like that. Now you kind of face the AGs in a bunch of states that told you, okay, if you want to do this, we're not going to allow pensions to invest in those funds. And so I think this clash with fiduciary duty and all these kind of things, it's probably why for now those tilts are kind of very small in practice. So yeah.
Thanks. We had one of our PhD committee who had a question. Yasmin, did you still want to ask that question? You could unmute and we could have you share that.
Sure, I would like to ask it. It is perhaps a bit of a naive question, but I would like to understand actually a certain aspect, and particularly also the relation to the literature of your findings, and particular maybe the Burke and van Binsbergen paper, because that paper, of course, seems to suggest that the cost of capital effect would be too small to actually have a meaningful impact. And I'm actually wondering what it is specifically in your paper that actually causes that result to flip. So is it something that they've overlooked in their model because you have, of course, much more general equilibrium setup? Or is it something specific that's leads to the difference in results?
I think the big picture is that so they study those things in a world in which mostly kind of a CAPM type world, in which the different assets, even if they're green or brown, from a financial perspective, they're kind of very easy to substitute, right? And investors actually do not get too much about substituting between them, or at least not enough that this kind of might compensate them. And so here it's a bit different because the assets are kind of meaningfully different in the sense that investors care much more about whether they want to invest in green or brown. So that aspect. But I think bigger picture here, the role of the intermediary is really why there's a big difference, right? Because in fact, the first part of the paper, which is without the tilt of the intermediary, I'm an optimistic guy, so I want to try to see the good side to this, which is green retail investors could have an impact. But quantitatively, it's kind of not super big, and it varies a lot with economic conditions. And so in that world, it could be that this is what's happening. Once you move to the world in which you really have the intermediate, which is central, and that starts tilting, then because it's kind of the side of the tilt for the whole economy in some sense, this can have a much more direct impact. So that would be my answer to this, but not saying that their point was not important. I think this has kind of generated a lot of thinking in the literature, and so I think a lot more to be said on this as well.
Awesome. So I'll read one quick comment before we get to another question. I think we've sparked a lot of good questions. So Pascal sort of followed up and said, more as a comment, recent excess returns of green assets may be driven by demand for green assets, given the preferences. Once that's stabilized, that should no longer drive superior returns, but such returns could hold, for instance, if climate policy is stricter. So I think there's a lot of interest in thinking about that.
It's a great point. I think that's kind of pretty much what the one of the pastors, someone tailored other paper is trying to make when they measure this green minus brown type returns in the data. You see that in terms of realized returns, it looks kind of very, very positive, as in green assets outperform financially. But then once you control for those transitory demand switches, or you look at kind of true measure of ex-ante return, like ICC and stuff like that, you get closer to something negative. And in fact, there's a recent paper by Pedersen, Thijs Jensen, and others that tries to kind of measure those kind of green premium in a very careful manner. Also seems to be going the slightly more negative way. But so yeah, great point.
Okay, so I think we have time for maybe one more question, though. There's a lot more, so we'll see how it goes. But
send me emails.
Yeah, so I'll read this one and you can answer this. Lawrence said, in pastor-like models, often one ends up with a cost of capital difference in dirty and clean firms, driven by preferences of some investors, not driven by additional risk. This very much sounds like a risk-free arbitrage strategy that sophisticated or cynical investors, hedge funds, could pick up by borrowing. As those models do not represent money creation via credit, I wonder if more realistic models would see these green premia disappear via this channel.
So that's a tough question. So I don't have a super clear answer to this for now, but I mean, I guess you could look at this kind of thing. The reason why I have this kind of neutral investor in the model, and I think other people have that too, is exactly to look at these kind of things, and to look at if basically there's enough of neutral investors, whether those things are kind of just undone, or at least quantitatively there's but very, very little left. And in some sense, this is also related to the kind of Berg and Van Biesbergen point, right? If there's enough people that don't really care, they're going to kind of arbitrage this away, and that's going to go away. And on a more kind of theoretical point, one way that you could get to this kind of question would be to try to look at kind of the long run survival of those agents in the model. Here there's a sense that maybe those investors are wrong, in the sense they think that those assets are better, but they're not. Or so is there a sense that in the long run the neutral investor is basically going to become bigger and bigger and price everything? So that could potentially go towards tackling this kind of questions. And there's a sense that if this is happening, that could be important. But yeah, I haven't really thought about it in super much detail. So that's pretty much all I'll say on this.
Well, thanks, Maxime. We are about out of time. I myself have some questions. I think there's some really interesting implications about production economies, externalities, and policy, but I'll save those for an email, perhaps. I think we'll be better suited there. I would encourage any of you as well, if you're interested in Maxime's work, a lot of great stuff, not only on climate finance, but sort of empirical, theoretical, computational asset pricing and application. So feel free to check out his website. He's at Boston in the finance department and affiliated with the econ department. So you can find him there, send him an email. I think we all appreciate questions and comments about this.
Yep.
Really great discussion. Really appreciate all the participation. I'll just remind everyone first, again, with the open call for papers, we would love to have anyone who would like to submit papers or present to submit those. We'd really appreciate that. And then our next webinar is going to take place on October 28th. So Ara Jo, who's at the University of Bath, will talk about her research on substitution between clean and dirty energy with biased technical change. Again, see the chat for more information there. Really appreciate the questions and a great presentation. Thanks so much, Maxime, and we will see you all soon in a couple of weeks.
All right. Thank you so much, Mike. Thank you, everyone, for your questions.
Yeah.